doesn't get a lot of play in the Russian media, in Russian official statements. It is rather this sense that precisely you cannot allow, as far as the Russians are concerned, they feel, you cannot allow their war to be confined to Ukraine. And this is why we are beginning to see this wider campaign of escalations already in terms of sabotage and subversive attacks. Because as far as they're concerned, when they look at, for example, the really quite successful Ukrainian campaign of sabotage and in some cases assassinations inside Russia, they do not seem to believe that Kyiv would have done this of its own volition. They believe that at the very least Kyiv would have had to have got the West's approval, and quite possibly it did it at the West's behest. So there is almost this sense that actually from their point of view, when seen through the sort of distorting lens of Putin's vision for, remember this is a man who doesn't really believe Ukraine exists as a country, through that thing he's just actually retaliating in kind. He is being, as he sees it, defensive in his moves. This is the problem. What we regard as escalation, he may often consider to be just simply retaliation.
Right. Now, all three of you, I imagine, talk to experts and policymakers in NATO and bordering countries. When you speak to them, what kind of escalation are they worried about? Mark?
Depends very much where they are. I mean, obviously, the countries which border onto Russia, which also tend to be the countries that have had their own experience of being under Moscow's rule, clearly are that much more concerned about direct military invasion. However unlikely it may seem to us, a safer distance away. Whereas when you look at other countries, again, it depends on where they perceive their own vulnerabilities to be. I mean, for example, in Italy, actually, and this is as it ties into the whole question of the sort of the more novel forms of pressure, they're currently worried about Russia's position in Libya, and the sense that if the Russians can actually establish a strong position in Libya, then they will be in a position to, in effect, turn on or turn off the taps of migrants heading across the Mediterranean into southern Italy. So I think this is actually something that is it's a nuanced picture, depending on the country in question, which of course puts real pressure on NATO, the European Union, and all these other kind of alliances, because precisely we are dealing with such a varied threat that it's very hard to actually come up with some kind of coherent response.
Jack, what do you hear?
Well, so I'll give you an example of the variety of threats. You know, the Russians are working very actively in Niger at the moment to have France's uranium concession removed and assigned to a Russian subsidiary company, so that they essentially not only become the main suppliers of enriched fuel to France, but then also own the uranium that France uses for its own enrichment upstream. And of course, France has most of its energy being produced through nuclear power. At the same time, we've seen a significant increase in the Russian presence in Yemen, looking to only assist the Iranians in developing more complex weapons that are being used against shipping from Yemen, but also now potentially to directly engage with the Houthis and assist them in striking international shipping. And then, of course, we've had the rather curious incident of the interconnectors, the Baltic connector between Estonia and Finland, but also then communications connectors between Sweden and Estonia being damaged subsurface. Now, it appears that was conducted by a Chinese vessel, but it was sailing next to a Russian vessel at the time. There are a lot of questions around this, and so there's significant anxiety about attacks on infrastructure, all of which could drive up prices and, directly harm a number of countries in the NATO alliance. And so Russia has quite a few ways of exerting pressure, and how you retaliate or respond or deter that sort of activity is difficult to be precise about.
Michael, is that broadly right, that actually what we shouldn't anticipate is, if there were a significant escalation, is Russian military activity on its bordering countries, possibly because actually it doesn't have sufficient military left over from the conflict in Ukraine?
Yes, so there are opportunities. I mean, the Georgian elections are in October, and they may well be followed by a lot of instability, a lot of domestic instability in Georgia because of the way they're being rigged at the moment. And Russians might try to manipulate that, and they can always try to manipulate the situation in Moldova, which is always very volatile and it's on a bit of a knife edge. But they would be rather conventional escalations of the instability that hinges around Ukraine at the moment. But I mean, I think what Mark and Jack were saying is absolutely right. If the Russians wanted to make a really big spectacular, to really hit the West in a fairly big way, it would probably be with a series of massive outages in some sense. But they could only probably do it once. It's generally believed by the cyber community in Britain that the Russians have got quite a lot of sleepers inside our cyber systems. And if they chose to activate them all in one go, they could create a great many outages that would have a cascading effect. Of course, they can only do it once because after the first time, the systems get changed and everything gets patched up. We don't know the real extent to which the Russians have infiltrated our cyber systems, or indeed to which we have infiltrated theirs. So it is possible that if a future Russian leadership really wanted to have a spectacular, novel effect in the West to indicate that it was prepared to escalate, and I'm not sure they would take that decision, but I think it is available to them to create a spectacular by attacking our electronic and cyber infrastructures. They have or believe to have the capacity to do that once in a big way.
Mark Galeotti.
That really raises the whole question of how deterrence works in this kind of non-military, non-kinetic form. Deterrence, classic deterrence, which is deterrence by punishment, depends on you being able to show your hand. I have the capacity to do this to you if you do that to me. When it comes to, for example, things like cyber, we precisely cannot demonstrate them because the moment at which you show your capability is the point at which the other side will then fix those vulnerabilities. So the real risk when it comes to deterrence is we may well have ways of striking back against Russia. Russia may well have ways of hurting us. But until, and God forbid, that actually gets used, none of us really knows what hand the other has.
Jack Watling, let's discuss that precise point. I remember, and I don't want to name drop here, but in a discussion some time ago when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and it was a private discussion, he said if only people understood just how vulnerable infrastructure actually was to attack, but thank God they don't.
Yes, there are a lot of single points of failure in most systems. And in particular, this is quite an interesting point, the Ukrainian energy grid has taken an awful lot of punishment over the last 2 years through Russian kinetic strikes with missiles. And yet the Ukrainian system, because it was government-owned and as a legacy of the Soviet Union, had a huge amount of slack capacity for transmission in its energy grid. In the West, most of our energy grids are controlled by the market. Therefore, they prioritize efficiency. And as a result, you don't build huge amounts of additional transmission capacity in the grid than what is required. And so a lot of our systems are quite lean, quite efficient, and also quite vulnerable. And that is a consideration. There's a lot of work being done across NATO at the moment to look at resilience as a form of deterrence. How do you show that actually the adversary can't unhinge your energy system with a relatively small number of actions?
Mark Galeotti, let's think about a scenario in which actually the Russians are looking like being defeated in Ukraine. In other words, they're not going to achieve any of their objectives. It's hard to imagine how that would happen, but nevertheless, let's imagine that it does. Would that change the risk calculation of the Russians about what it was that they were prepared to do?
Well, of course, when we talk about the Russians, we're really talking about one particular man, Vladimir Putin, and the degree to which he has harnessed his political career as well as his historic legacy, something we know that he does obsess about on this war, is indeed a dangerous factor. So I think that, yes, it's hard to see the Russians going quietly if it looks like they're losing this war, or going to lose this war, quite whatever winning or losing means. But the key point is this, is that they have a wide range of escalatory options that have nothing to do with us. He could, for example, mobilize a lot more men, even though that carries with it some substantial political risks and also becomes increasingly hard to know how to house them and arm them and train them and so forth. He could even, God forbid, take the route of thinking that, in fact, he could use some kind of non-strategic nuclear strike as some kind of signal to say, look, I will blow up some random island somewhere distant from any population centre, but next time I could be hitting Kiev. The point is, all of these are in some ways Pyrrhic options. They carry with it massive risks for Russia and indeed for Putin himself. But he has them. But the point is he can keep these apparently discreet from his wider conflict with the West. Because when it comes down to it, the sorts of catastrophic attacks he might choose to launch against the West through cyber or whatever are issues that actually have been recognised as falling within the purview of Article 5, which is the common NATO agreement that an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, it's also very difficult to know quite how would we respond. Would we be sending cruise missiles in response to a cyber attack? I mean, that would be a very, very difficult political question. But the point is, I think there is still quite a substantial deterrent element in terms of moves against the West for anything of that kind of scale.
Michael Clarke, the thrust of my questions have all really been about Russia's willingness to escalate or being pushed into a situation where it feels it needs to escalate. But of course, there's another scenario which one can imagine, which is that Ukraine is in real danger, and at which point the West decides it needs somehow to increase the pressure on Russia, probably militarily, I would guess, in order to stop that from happening. How might that take place, or would it take place?
Well, whether or not it would take place is obviously a political question, and that will depend on the outcome partly of the American elections and the trend in European politics into next year. In theory, could it take place? Yes, it could. If the Western world decided that the effective defeat of Ukraine was so serious, was so bad for the West and bad for world order, and I think it would be personally, but if politicians in the West felt that, they could get more involved by, let's say, operating a no-fly zone over Ukrainian territory, which would prevent Russian aircraft from operating. They could give more direct help or become more directly involved in evening up the disparity in the air war. That would be a very dangerous thing to do, but we're talking here about escalation. They could do more in the Black Sea if they chose to. Whether or not the Western world would stay united to do this is an interesting point. And most analysts have said, we want to help Ukraine enough that that doesn't become the problem, that we're not drawn to have to make those decisions. And the time to avoid making those decisions sometime in the middle of next year is now. And a lot of Western politicians agree with that. They nod sagely and then they go off and don't do it.
Jack Watling, what do you think about that?
Well, if Ukraine is in a situation where it is on the cusp of defeat, then there is the question of whether NATO forces would start to try and stabilize the situation, which would probably mean boots on the ground in Ukraine. But I think we also, if we're talking about escalation, have to look at not immediate escalation, but escalation over time and escalation risk over time. There is another scenario in which the Russians essentially force Kyiv into a negotiated outcome of some kind, which is very favorable for the Russians. They therefore stop taking losses and casualties and start regenerating their forces. And at that point, in a couple of years, the Russians will be militarily very strong, but also still probably have, and certainly Putin will still have, the view that the West has done massive damage to Russia and it has hostile intent towards Russia. And at that point, the threat to nations on Russia's borders becomes a much more open question. And so, especially if there's concurrency in threats between an escalation over Taiwan, let's say, that draws US capacity into the Indo-Pacific, in combination with a Russian threat in Europe. And so actually the risks of escalation for NATO, I think, become much more tangible after Russian operations conclude in Ukraine, irrespective of how that turns out, than while the Russian army is on the ground in Ukraine and fighting the Ukrainians.
Right. All of you have reminded us that quite a lot of this is contingent upon political decisions. Again, you've all three of you been in touch with policymakers in Europe and in America. What is your understanding of their determination or lack of determination to face off the worst of these threats? Mark?
Again, I think it depends dramatically where you happen to be standing. If one, let's say, looks at what the Poles are doing, I mean, Warsaw has been putting a lot of resources into its military. They bought up 1,000 new tanks, which, frankly, only has one purpose. That is for a mass land industrial war, which essentially would mean a potential war with Russia. These are not forces that can be deployed easily to distant battlefields in the Middle East or anything like that. So, some countries are actually being very serious about not just signaling their determination, but also actually building the capacities needed, because you can't just order these off Amazon and have them delivered next week tomorrow on Prime. Elsewhere, let's be perfectly honest, one gets a lot of rhetoric, but little relative action. Point of the matter is, and in some ways this is precisely Putin's calculation, he regards us as an astonishingly powerful alliance, but also a very weak alliance, precisely because we're a constellation of democracies. And then therefore he thinks that we tend to get easily distracted and find it very difficult to take tough decisions. Very few politicians in the West these days could not find alternative uses for money, whether it's in terms of for tax cuts or for building up public services or whatever else. The notion that we should be spending a lot more on either the defence of Ukraine, but also in parallel with that, building up our own defence industries to the necessary level, as well as building up our national militaries, that's all something that, again, everyone agrees with to a degree in principle. But when it comes to the actual policies, when it comes to the budgets, I'm not really seeing it.
Right. Jack, let's talk about America now, because obviously a large amount of the money, a large amount of the equipment comes from America. We have the election in November. Is it the view in Europe and in bordering countries to Russia that the election is absolutely critical to what happens subsequently? In other words, it will make the biggest of differences who is actually elected?
It is generally perceived as very, very critical to the outcome insofar as the Trump campaign has articulated a policy which would force Ukraine to the negotiating table and actually extend certain conditionality on things like Article 5 potentially to other NATO members. So there are some fundamental questions for the security of Europe that would arise from the policies that have been suggested from the Trump campaign. However, I think people overestimate the extent to which the US will remain militarily committed even under a Harris administration. And the reason I highlight that is that the US has a growing gap in its capabilities in core areas in relation to the People's Republic of China. And the threat from the PRC against Taiwan is becoming an acute one. And so more and more US capacity over the next few years is going to have to shift into the Indo-Pacific. And the pitch from the Democratic side as well in the US to European partners is, look, this is the biggest security crisis facing Europe since the Second World War. This is on you to bear the burden of that. And some countries in Europe, Mark mentioned Poland, have responded to that. Others have responded rhetorically, and I'd put the UK in this category, but have not responded in terms of making the industrial investments at the scale necessary to make our own defense sustainable. And so the US is still the primary supplier of arms to Ukraine, which means that actually I think that the idea that there's huge uncertainty here is something that people use because they want to believe that it will be, continuation under a Harris administration, but actually there are some fundamental messages coming from the US that are bipartisan about what Europe needs to do.
Michael, is that the way you see it?
Yes, I think as far as European security is concerned, we have passed, as it were, peak America in relation to the Ukraine crisis. America's commitment to Ukraine will be diminishing from here on. The Europeans will have to do a great deal more. The difference between a Republican and a Democratic administration next year is the speed with which that transition happens. In a Democratic administration, it will be a more gentle glide path, I think. In a Republican administration, it might be a bit more abrupt. But the fact is, both Ukraine and European security will have to get on in the future with considerably less American commitment. We are past the peak, even though that peak was pretty high and remarkably high in 2022, to a degree that surprised many of us. But we shouldn't settle back on that. We're back to the older historical trends where the United States will be less concerned with European security, won't ignore it, but less concerned, and far more concerned with security in the Asia-Pacific.
My thanks to Michael Clark, Mark Galeotti and Jack Watling. And that's it for this rather scary mini-series on the biggest threats to world peace. But I can't stress enough, the programmes weren't predictions, just possibilities. We'll be back